You can pre-order Modern Horizons 3 using my link in the description. Hi everyone, I'm Nita Hone, and in this video I'm continuing with my Modern Horizons 3 set review. I've already covered all the cards in the main set, and today we're looking at the bonus sheet cards that can appear in play boosters. A bonus sheet is a subset of cards that generally have a dedicated slot in play boosters. In this set, the main bonus sheet is a set of 42 cards that have never been legal in Modern before, but will be with the release of Modern Horizons 3. While that bonus sheet is the one that will come up the most, since every pack has a card from it, there are also two other smaller subsets of cards that can appear in play boosters much more infrequently that we'll cover in this video: Special Guests and the Mythic Rares from Modern Horizons 3 Commander. These don't have a dedicated slot. They'll appear in the wildcard slot very rarely, so you won't see them all that much, but there's only 10 Special Guests and 8 Commander Mythics, so I figured I'd cover them too. For each of these cards, I discuss how I think they'll perform in Limited, that means Draft and Sealed, and I'll punctuate each evaluation with a letter grade. If you're new to my set reviews and unsure of what my letter grades mean, you can find a guide in the description. Unlike most cards in set reviews, I've actually played with many of these cards since they are reprints apart from the Commander cards, but even then, the context of a new format can change things up, so I may end up being wrong about some things. However, as the format comes into focus, I'll be doing videos where I discuss how things have turned out. Lastly, I want to let you know that there is a set review related perk for being a channel member or a patron. You get a spreadsheet with all of my grades once the set review is complete, which means later today. If that interests you, check out the description where you can find out how to support the channel using one of those methods. Alright, let's look at the bonus sheet cards in Modern Horizons 3, starting with the new to Modern bonus sheet. The first of these cards is Angel of the Ruins, which for 5 generic and 2 white is a 5/7 artifact creature angel at uncommon. It's got flying, and when it enters the battlefield, you exile up to 2 target artifacts and or enchantments, and it's got plain cycling for 2 generic. This format has enough targets for her enter the battlefield ability, so it isn't crazy to think she comes down late and exiles something, or even 2 things. So the fact you can cash her in for a land earlier in the game is nice, as it means you can get rid of her if you draw her early, which isn't going to feel great, while still having big upside late, giving her a C. Next up, it's Decree of Justice, which is XX 2 generic and 2 white for an uncommon sorcery. You create X 4/4 white angel creature tokens with flying. You can also cycle it for 2 generic and a white, and when you cycle it, you can pay X, and if you do, you create X 1/1 white soldier creature token. So basically, you can pay 6 for 1/4/4 flyer, which isn't great, or you can cycle it for 6 and get 3 1/1s and a card. Obviously, there are more modes than that, but those are 2 pretty common outcomes. If your deck can really produce mana, this can be particularly spicy, but it's never going to be super efficient. I'm giving it a C. Next, it's Distinguished Conjurer, which for 1 generic and a white is a 1/2 human wizard at uncommon. Whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, you gain 1 life, and you can pay 4 generic and a white and tap it to exile another target creature you control and return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. Incidental life gain on a 2-mana 1/2 is fine, and this has a sometimes useful late game mana sink. I think it's a C. Next up, it's Orum's Chant, which for 1 white mana is a rare instant with kicker for 1 white. Target player can't cast spells this turn. If the spell was kicked, creatures can't attack this turn. This is a glorified fog effect in Limited, and fogs tend to be awful in Limited because they don't have a real impact on the board and generally only delay the inevitable. And that's when they are actually useful. There are lots of situations where a card like Orum's Chant is entirely irrelevant. I'm giving it an F. Next up, it's Recruiter of the Guard, which for 2 generic and a white is a 1/1 human soldier at Mythic Rare. When it enters the battlefield, you search your library for a creature card with toughness 2 or less, reveal it, put it into your hand, and then shuffle. This isn't a good stat line, but if you have something powerful to tutor up, you're okay with that. It may not be much of a body, but you do add to the board and draw a card, and if it's one of the best cards in your deck, that's not a bad deal, and you usually have something worth tutoring up in most Limited decks without trying that hard, even if it isn't one of the best cards in your deck. I'm giving this a C+. Next, it's Seven's Reclamation, which for 2 generic and a white is a rare sorcery. Return target permanent card with mana value 3 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. If this spell was cast from a graveyard, you may copy this spell and you may choose a new target for the copy, and it has flashback for 4 generic and a white, which means you can cast it from your graveyard for that cost and then exile it. When you aren't flashing this back, it's pretty bad. 3 mana to get a small thing back from the graveyard will usually not be worth it, and if it is, it's just barely worth it. But because it has flashback and you get an extra copy when you flash it back, Reclamation can represent a 3-for-1, but it does need some pretty serious setup to actually generate all that value, giving it a C+. Next, we've got Deep Analysis, which for 3 generic and a blue is an uncommon sorcery. Target player draws 2 cards, and it has flashback for 1 generic and a blue and pay 3 life. This is a pure draw spell, but it can potentially be a 4 for 1 because of flashback, and it's often pretty nice to mill or discard it because it's a really efficient draw spell from the graveyard, giving it a C+. Next up, it's Estrid's Invocation, which for 2 generic and a blue is a rare enchantment. You may have Estrid's Invocation enter the battlefield as a copy of an enchantment you control, except it has, at the beginning of your upkeep, you may exile this enchantment. If you do, return it to the battlefield under its owner's control. This set has a lot of enchantments, but not so many that this will always be able to do something. In fact, it will often do nothing, and it will often do substantially less than 3 mana's worth of value. Even when it does something, I think it's a D. Next up, it's Kappa Cannoneer, which for 5 generic and a blue is a 4/4 artifact creature turtle warrior at rare. It's got Improvise, which means your artifacts can help you cast it. Each artifact you tap after you're done activating mana abilities pays for 1 generic. It's got Ward for 4 generic, and when it or another artifact enters the battlefield under your control, you put a +1/+1 counter on Kappa Cannoneer, and it can't be blocked this turn. This set has a lot of artifacts, so getting the Cannoneer down ahead of schedule isn't a huge challenge, and neither is growing it. And keep in mind it does grow itself, so it's effectively a 5/5, and by being a substantial body that can grow with Ward 4, it represents a very real threat, especially because sometimes it'll be unblockable. Of course, getting him into play early and buffing him isn't as automatic here as it is in other formats, but he's still pretty good, giving him a B+. Next, it's Reef Worm, which for 3 generic and a blue is a 0/1 worm at uncommon. When it dies, you create a 3/3 bluefish creature token with, when this creature dies, create a 6/6 blue whale creature token with, when this creature dies, create a 9/9 blue kraken creature token. A 4 mana 0/1 is horrendous, but the idea here is to jump something or sacrifice it, and then you get a much nicer creature, and it keeps getting better from there. This can potentially generate a 3 for 1, and all for only 4 mana. It's really hard to say no to that. I'm giving this a B+. Next, it's Shrieking Drake, which for 1 blue mana is a 1/1 Drake at uncommon with flying. When it enters the battlefield, you return a creature you control to its owner's hand. If you can get some value out of bouncing something to your hand, this will feel alright. The problem is you don't always have that, and it isn't a May trigger, so you basically can't play the Drake on turn 1, and if you don't have something you want to bounce, you just can't really play it. I'm giving it a D+. Next, it's Buried Alive, which for 2 generic and a blue is an uncommon sorcery. Search your library for up to 3 creature cards and put them into your graveyard, then shuffle. This is here purely for Modern. It is awful and limited. You spend 3 mana for effectively nothing. It's an F. Next up, it's Kyrix, Son of Yawgmoth, which for 4 generic and 3 black Phyrexian mana is a 2/2 legendary Phyrexian horror minion at rare. Phyrexian mana can be played with either black or 2 life. It's got lifelink. For each black and a cost, you may pay 2 life rather than pay that mana. Whenever you cast a black spell, put a +1/+1 counter on Kyrix, Son of Yawgmoth. We saw in the black set review that there are a few intriguing cards that make you want to go mono black, and Kyrix is another one on that list, I guess. His ability to grow and gain you life makes it easier for you to play discounted spells and stuff. Of course, you're not always going to have spells to discount, and Kyrix all on his own is pretty bad. Paying a bunch of mana and or life or some combination thereof for a 2/2 isn't where you want to be, so he's a pretty bad top deck and not that easy to set up early. He's a cool card for other formats, but in limited he kind of looks bad, giving him a D. Next up, it's Nadier's Nightblade, which for 2 generic and a black is a 1/3 elf warrior at uncommon. Whenever a token you control leaves the battlefield, each opponent loses 1 life and you gain 1 life. This format does have tokens, and this is a pretty powerful token payoff, even if the stat line's not great. But black also isn't overloaded with tokens. There's not like a ton of treasure in this set, for example, then it would get pretty silly. It's probably just a C. Next up, it's Ophiomancer, which for 2 generic and a black is a 2/2 human shaman at rare. At the beginning of each upkeep, if you control no snakes, create a 1/1 black snake creature token with Death Touch. This isn't quite as good as a 3 mana 2/2 that makes a 1/1 Death Toucher. That would be like a B or a B+. It's worse than that in many ways, namely, you don't get that 1/1 for a whole turn, but it's better in one way too. You can treat that 1/1 as expendable fodder since you get another one every upkeep. You can always threaten to trade it and your opponent knows you're going to get another one, which is a big problem. I'm giving this a C+. Next, it's Toxic Deluge, which for 2 generic and a black is a rare sorcery. As an additional cost to cast this spell, pay X life. All creatures get -X/-X until end of turn. This can sweep the entire board for only 3 mana, and because you get to decide what X is, it can be even better, because you can choose a value for X that hurts your opponent more than it hurts you. Paying life is a bit of a liability sometimes, but casting Toxic Deluge is often just going to win you the game. It's insanely strong and insanely efficient, giving it an A. Next, it's Victimize, which for 2 generic and a black is an uncommon sorcery. It says choose 2 target creature cards in your graveyard, sacrifice a creature. If you do, return the chosen cards to the battlefield tapped. We saw this as a special guest card recently, but now you're going to see a lot more of it because it's an uncommon with a dedicated slot in the booster pack. It does have potential to be powerful. You give up Victimize and a creature in play to reanimate 2 things. It's not card positive, but if the things you're getting back are huge, then it's going to feel pretty good. But the setup isn't always easy to come by. You really need the 2 creatures for it to be worth it, and you need something reasonably expendable and or something really awesome to bring back. Otherwise, the exchange isn't really worth it. When we saw it in the Karlov Manor special guest list, it did not fare well, though it was a small sample size as a result of being a special guest card, and that format as a whole had a lower power level when it came to creatures than this one does. Still, it probably takes too much work to be more than a C. Next, it's Cursed Mirror, which for 2 generic and a red is a rare artifact. You can tap it for red, and as it enters the battlefield, you may have it become a copy of any creature on the battlefield until end of turn, except it has haste. 3 mana rocks that tap for only 1 color of mana are almost never worth it in limited, but becoming a hasty creature on the turn it comes down is intriguing because it means that it can have an actual impact other than mana production. Still, it doesn't add to the board permanently, and it doesn't fix your mana, and sometimes you're just not going to be able to attack because you need to hold on to this artifact. That said, being an artifact in this set, especially in red, does have some extra value, but it's probably just a C. Next, it's Fledgling Dragon, which for 2 generic and 2 red is a 2/2 dragon at uncommon. It's got flying and threshold. As long as 7 or more cards are in your graveyard, it gets +3/+3 and has 1 red mana. Fledgling Dragon gets +1/+0 until end of turn. 4 mana 2/2s are bad because they die to 1 mana removal. So one that doesn't give you something up front is a pretty huge liability. But if your deck can get threshold going, obviously this becomes a very real threat. Red isn't exactly adept at making that happen, but it's still likely to be the case by the late game. Giving this a C+. Next up, it's Lelia, the Blade Forge, which for 2 generic and a red is a 2/2 legendary spirit warrior. At rare, it's got haste. Whenever Lelia, the Blade Reforged attacks, exile the top card of your library. You may play that card this turn. Whenever 1 or more cards are put into exile from your library and or your graveyard, put a +1/+1 counter on Lelia. So she's effectively a 3 mana 3/3 with haste, and she can grow and effectively draw you cards every time she attacks. She's a huge threat when she comes down early, and if you have her late, you can probably take advantage of the card she draws, and a 3/3 haste usually isn't something that can be completely ignored even in the late game, and she can just completely run away with the game if you play her early. She's a bomb, giving her an A-. Next up, it's Meltdown for X and a red. It's an uncommon sorcery. Destroy each artifact with mana value X or less. There are a lot of artifacts in this set. The downside is, red is one of the colors really interested in them, so if you're having this in your deck, you probably also have a lot of artifacts. Still, you get to choose the value of X, so you can make it kind of one-sided. It probably needs to be a sideboard card overall, as it isn't like every opponent has enough artifacts for this to make sense. It's probably a D in your main deck, but like a B out of your sideboard, because it's just going to be so good against artifact decks. It may be best to play off of a splash or something like that in a deck that doesn't care about artifacts at all. Next up, it's Meteoric Mace, which for 4 generic and 2 red is an uncommon artifact equipment. The equipped creature gets +4/+0 and has trample. It has equipped for 4 generic, and it has Cascade, which means that when you cast it, you exile cards from the top of your library until you exile a non-land card that costs less. You may cast it without paying its mana cost, put the exiled cards on the bottom in a random order. This is super expensive to play and equip for the buff, even if it does make virtually any creature into a threat. So it's a good thing it gives you Cascade up front. But even with that, the Mace's inefficiency is often going to keep you from feeling great about casting it. If you Cascade into something that's like 3 mana or less, you're going to still feel pretty let down. This just doesn't give you a legit 2-for-1 the way most Cascade cards do, because the actual card is so mediocre. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Annoyed Altasaur, which for 5 generic and 2 green is a 6/5 dinosaur at uncommon with reach and trample, and it has Cascade. Now this is a good way to do Cascade because you'll usually easily get 7 mana worth of value. A 6/5 reach and trample obviously doesn't get there, but as long as you hit like a 2-drop, you'll feel good, and you'll often hit something even better. It'll almost always give you a 2-for-1. I'm giving it a B. Next up, it's Branching Evolution, which for 2 generic and a green is a rare enchantment. If 1 or more +1/+1 counters would be put on a creature you control, twice that many +1/+1 counters are put on that creature instead. There are a lot of counters in green, but I'm never in love with a card that doesn't do anything on its own. Spending 3 on this just seems like a bad idea early, and when you get it late, it's going to be harder to take advantage of. That means it's kind of only good in like the mid game. I'm giving it a D. Next, it's Priest of Titania, which for 1 generic and a green is a 1/1 elf druid and uncommon. You can tap it for a green mana for each elf on the battlefield. Elves aren't a massive theme in this set, but there are elves in it, and even on her own, she's a passable 2 mana 1/1 that taps for green, giving her a C+. Next up, it's Sylvan Safekeeper, which for 1 green mana is a 1/1 human wizard at rare. You can sacrifice a land to give a creature you control Shroud until end of turn. Shroud means it can't be the target of spells or abilities, and remember, that means your own. This is not hexproof. So this gives you a free way to protect creatures. Even if you're tapped out, your opponent's removal no longer represents a threat, and that is a huge deal. Giving up lands can hurt eventually, but losing a land to blank removal is definitely worth it. I'm giving this a B. Next, it's Wirewood Symbiote, which for 1 green mana is a 1/1 insect at uncommon. Return an elf you control to its owner's hand. Untap target creature, activate only once each turn. Yeah, this is here for Modern to power up the elf decks there. In Limited, you both need elves around and or elves worth returning to your hand and or other creatures worth untapping. It's mostly just a 1 mana 1/1 in Limited, and that's not worth playing. I'm giving it an F. Next, we've got Breya Ethereum Shaper, which for a white, a blue, a black, and a red is a 4/4 legendary artifact creature human at Mythic Rare. When she enters the battlefield, you create 2 1/1 Blue Thopter artifact creature tokens with flying, and you can pay 2 generic and sacrifice 2 artifacts and choose one. You can do 3 damage to target player or planeswalker. A creature can get -4/-4 until end of turn, or you can gain 5 life. She's super hard to cast, but she's very powerful. If you can cast her, there's no doubt she's a bomb. You get a 4/4 and 2 1/1 Thopters for 4 mana, and then you can cash in your artifacts for all sorts of great effects. But you can't really give a card a bomb grade when she's going to be stuck in your hand a lot because of mana requirements. I'm giving her a B. Next, it's Kalia of the Vast, which for 1 generic, a red, a white, and a black is a 2/2 legendary human cleric at Mythic Rare. She's got flying, and when she attacks an opponent, you may put an angel, demon, or dragon creature card from your hand onto the battlefield tapped and attacking that opponent. She's mostly a 4 mana 2/2 flyer that's hard to cast in Limited. You just won't have enough creatures to cheat into play, and even when you do, there aren't going to be insane, Gristlebrand and stuff like that isn't in this format. I'm giving her a D+. The whole cycle of medallions is on this bonus sheet, and they're all 2 generic for rare artifacts that decrease the cost of a spell of that color by 1 generic. Pearl Medallion, for example, decreases the cost of white spells by 1 generic. These are all really bad in Limited. You really can't play cards that don't do anything but give you a discount in Limited. You're just going to fall too far behind, and your cards generally aren't powerful enough that a discount is going to make a massive difference. These are just an F collectively. Next, there's Junk Diver, which for 3 generic is a 1/1 artifact creature bird, and uncommon it's got flying, and when it dies, you return another target artifact card from your graveyard to your hand. This card used to be really good, but times have changed a lot. A 3 mana 1/1 flyer is brutal, and getting an artifact back in your hand is hardly enough to offset that. You don't usually get a 2-for-1 since the diver itself is so insignificant. I'm giving it a D+. Next up, it's Urza's Incubator, which for 3 generic is a rare artifact. As it enters the battlefield, choose a creature type. Creature spells of the chosen type cost 2 less to cast. So like with the medallions, a card that's just a discount doesn't make it in your deck in Limited. It just doesn't do enough in Limited. And this is even worse because it's more restrictive in a set where there's not even a heavy creature type theme. It's an F. Next, it's Worn Power Stone, which for 3 generic is an uncommon artifact. It enters the battlefield tapped, and you can tap it for 2 colorless. Spending 3 and not adding to the board can be a real bad idea, but you're going to have 6 mana on your next turn. Of course, you don't always have a way to reap those rewards, and it's an awful top deck, but the upside is there, especially in a set with Eldrazi. I'm giving it a C+. Next, we've got Barbarian Ring, an uncommon land that can tap for red, and it deals 1 damage to you, and it has Threshold. Sacrifice Barbarian Ring, it deals 2 damage to any target. Sure, this will do damage to you, but it's going to be worth it a lot of the time since in the late game it's a land that you can turn into shock. Having a land turn into a real card is no small thing. I'm giving this a C+. Next, we've got Cephalid Coliseum, which is an uncommon land that can tap for blue and deal 1 damage to you, and it has Threshold, blue, and tap it. Sacrifice Cephalid Coliseum. Target player draws 3 cards and then discards 3 cards. Activate only if 7 or more cards are in your graveyard. Turning your land into draw 3 and discard 3 late is pretty amazing, especially in a set that has a deck that's all about drawing cards. I think this one's a C+ too. Next up, it's Deserted Temple, which is a rare land that can tap for colorless, and you can pay 1 generic and tap it to untap a land. Colorless mana is useful in this set for sure, but this card's activated ability is almost never relevant in Limited. There are better colorless sources around that have more utility or don't hurt your mana base. This is an F. Next, it's Nesting Grounds, an uncommon land that can tap for colorless. You can pay 1 generic and tap it to move a counter from target permanent you control onto another target permanent. Activate only as a sorcery. Counters are a thing in this format, but moving them around at sorcery speed isn't exactly powerful, especially when attached to a land that hurts your mana base. Again, like I said about the last card, producing colorless is better than usual in this set, but you can find ways to do it that don't involve just tapping for colorless and having an underwhelming effect. I think this is an F. Next, it's Phyrexian Tower, a mythic rare legendary land that can tap for colorless, and you can tap it and sack a creature for 2 black mana. See, this is a land that produces colorless that I'll actually play. It can help you cast your colorless stuff while also retaining the ability to produce black when you need it to, and it can even give you a legit mana boost when you do it. I'm giving it a C+. Alright, so that's the new to modern bonus sheet. Let's move now to the special guests. Remember, these special guests are a lot rarer than bonus sheet cards. You're going to see one bonus sheet card in every pack. You're going to see special guest cards like 1% of the time or something like that. Alright, so our first one is Thought-Knot Seer, which for 3 generic and a colorless is a 4/4 Eldrazi. And when it enters a battlefield, target opponent reveals their hand, you choose a non-land card from it and exile that card. And when it leaves the battlefield, target opponent draws a card. He might not be as impressive as the Eldrazi Titans in a vacuum, but Thought-Knot Seer is probably the best Eldrazi ever printed, based on how it's performed in 60-card formats. And it's really good in limited too, though you're not going to be powering it out on turn 1 or 2 in this format like you can in the non-rotating 60-card formats. But it's still a 4-mana 4/4 that takes your opponent's best non-land away from them, and while they do get a card back if the Seer ever goes down, the card that they get back is almost assuredly going to be worse. The colorless mana is a bit of a pain to produce, but it's not that hard by turn 4, giving this a B+. Next up, it's Prismatic Ending, which for X and a white is a sorcery with Converge. Exile target non-land permanent if its mana value is less than or equal to the number of colors of mana spent to cast this spell. Paying 2 mana to exile non-lands at cost 2 is the most common outcome here, and that's not great. The more colors you have, the better it gets, but you also never really get to trade up with Prismatic Ending. It is really flexible in terms of the permanent types it deals with, at least. Sometimes you're going to be stuck on one color, though, and it'll feel really bad. I think it's just a C+. Next, it's Dismember, which for 1 generic and 2 black Phyrexian mana is an instant. Target creature gets -5/-5 until end of turn. This is a crazy efficient removal spell. For 1 mana, it can kill almost anything, and you can play it in any color deck. It does get better in a black deck that can pay black mana for the Phyrexian mana, but it's great anywhere. This is a B+. Next, it's Persist, which for 1 generic and a black is a sorcery. Return target non-legendary creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a -1/-1 counter on it. It's not quite Reanimate, but it is a fairly efficient reanimation spell. Only going for your graveyard is a bummer, and the -1/-1 counter does make its efficiency a little less impressive, but it's not that hard to get back something worth more than 2 mana with this. I'm giving it a C+. Next, there's Expressive Iteration, which for a blue and a red is a sorcery. Look at the top 3 cards of your library, put one of them into your hand, put one of them on the bottom of your library, and exile one of them. You may play the exiled card this turn. This isn't quite as insane and limited as it is in 60-card formats, but it's pretty good. It's often 2 mana to draw the 2 best cards of your top 3. The problem in limited is that you do legitimately whiff sometimes, and it turns into a card that only lets you draw 1 in those cases, especially early, but it's still a pretty nice card, giving it a C+. Alright, next we have Solitude, and we actually have every one of the 5 elemental incarnations for Modern Horizons 2 on this special guest sheet. 3 generic and 2 white, it's a 3/2 elemental incarnation with flash and lifelink, and when it enters a battlefield, exile up to 1 other target creature. That creature's controller gains life equal to its power, and it has Evoke. Exile a white card from your hand. Evoke means that you can cast it for this cost, but if you do it that way, you sacrifice it immediately when it enters the battlefield. In other words, you're just paying for the enter the battlefield ability. A 5-mana 3/2 with Flash and Lifelink that exiles your opponent's best creature is amazing. It's an amazing 2-for-1, and Flash means you might even get more than a 2-for-1. Sometimes evoking this for free will be worth doing too. One interesting thing to keep in mind for all of these is that the modal double-face lands can be exiled for the free evoke cost provided they are the right color, so it might be easier than normal to evoke these because you're going to have more cards that have color than you normally do. Though as we'll see, for some of them, evoking them isn't a great idea unlimited anyway, and even with Solitude, you're only going to evoke it when there's an emergency. Otherwise, you're going to want to wait to get the full value. Anyway, this is an easy A+. Next, it's Subtlety, which for 2 generic and 2 blue is a 3/3 elemental incarnation with flash and flying. When it enters the battlefield, you choose up to 1 target creature spell or planeswalker spell. Its owner puts it on the bottom of their library or top, and you can evoke it, exile a blue card from your hand. While it's not exactly a counterspell, it gets pretty close. It still trades 1 for 1 like a counterspell does. It's just that your opponent has the option of drawing it again on their next turn. But adding a 3/3 flying body with flash that trades 1 for 1 up front like that is awesome, and the fail case is fine. This is another one that you can evoke in emergencies, but ideally you're going to want to wait to get the full value. I'm giving it an A-. Next, it's Glyph, which for 2 generic and 2 black is a 3/2 elemental incarnation with menace. When it enters the battlefield, target opponent reveals their hand. You choose a non-land card from it, that player discards that card, and it has evoke, exile a black card from your hand. It's kind of funny that they have this and Thought-Knots here on this sheet, as they are very similar cards. Anyway, a 4-mana 3/2 menace that makes your opponent discard their best non-land is pretty sweet. You won't always hit something with the enter the battlefield ability, but you will often enough for this to be really good. Evoking it for free isn't exactly advisable in limited, but it's upside in an already great card, giving it a B+. Next up, it's Fury, which for 3 generic and 2 red is a 3/3 elemental incarnation with double strike. When it enters the battlefield, it deals 4 damage divided as you choose among any number of target creatures and or planeswalkers, and of course it has evoke, exile a red card from your hand. This is kind of awkward. They printed this as a Modern Horizons special guest, but it's banned in Modern. Guess they didn't see that coming. Anyway, this card is nuts. A 5-mana 3/3 with double strike that does 4 divided damage is already a bomb in limited. It's an easy 2 for 1 and sometimes better than that. But being able to evoke this is a big deal too, because sometimes you're tapped out or it's early, and getting this ETB just wins you the game. You're usually going to be able to be at least card neutral when you do that too. This one's an A+. And our last special guest is the only remaining elemental incarnation, Endurance, which for 1 generic and 2 green is a 3/4 elemental incarnation with flash and reach. When it enters the battlefield, up to 1 target player puts all the cards from their graveyard on the bottom of their library in a random order. A 3-mana 3/4 with flash is something you're always going to play. It's really not hard to ambush block something and get a 2 for 1 with a creature this big and efficient. The graveyard part isn't entirely relevant, like it's the weakest of these into the battlefield abilities in limited, and that also means this one's really not worth evoking most of the time, but it's a really efficient creature. You can get 2 for 1s just thanks to its size and flash, giving it a B. Alright, that leaves the Commander Mythics, which basically means the face commander for the 4 commander decks and the secondary commander for those 4 commander decks. The first of these is Aclazotz, the Swelling Scourge, which for 3 generic mana is a 2/2 legendary Eldrazi. When it or another colorless creature you control dies, you get an experience counter. You can pay 1 mana of each color, and creatures you control get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is the number of experience counters you have. Scions and Spawns you control gain Indestructible and Annihilator 1 until end of turn. Grey Ogre's pretty bad, and while getting experience counters themselves isn't a huge stretch, being able to get them going and still have creatures in play that can really benefit, and having 5 colors of mana is all just asking too much. So actually making Aclazotz do his thing in limited looks pretty difficult, giving him a D-. Next, it's Glyph, Famed Mechanist, which for 1 generic, a blue, a red, and a white is a 3/3 legendary Dwarf Artificer. It's got Fabricate 1, and that means when it enters the battlefield, you can either put a +1/+1 counter on it or make a 1/1 servo. It also says other non-token creatures you control have Fabricate 1, and you can pay 2 generic and tap it and choose one, Populate, which means you make a copy of one of your tokens, or you can Proliferate, which means you can choose any number of permanents you have and add a counter to it, if they already have a counter. Glyph looks pretty good. The 3 colors of mana is fairly doable, and the base rate here is either a 4-mana 4/4 or a 4-mana 3/3 and a 1/1, and then you have an ability that can allow you to reap the benefits of whatever options you went with, and this format has plenty of tokens and counters for you to take advantage of that aren't made by Glyph, and then adding Fabricate 1 to all of your non-token creatures is pretty nuts, giving this an A. Next up, it's Koram, the Undertaker, which for 1 generic, a black, a red, and a green is a 0/5 legendary human warrior. It gets +X/+0, where X is the greatest power among creature cards in all graveyards. When it attacks, each player mills a card, and during each of your turns, you may play a land and cast a spell from among cards in graveyards that were put there from libraries this turn. So he's going to have variable power, and sometimes it's not going to be very high. His mill trigger does help both of his abilities, and I think the main value from Koram in Limited will come from the ability to play lands and cast spells that get milled. Because he lets you go after spells and lands, you're likely to get at least one of those just from his attack trigger, provided, he survives. But this will work well with other mill stuff too, and there's plenty of that in the set. He takes a bit of work, but he's a pretty insane engine when he gets going, giving him a B. Next up, it's Disa the Restless, which for 2 generic, a black, a red, and a green is a 5/6 human scout. Whenever a Lurgoyf permanent card is put into your graveyard from anywhere other than the battlefield, put it onto the battlefield. Whenever one or more creatures you control deals combat damage to a player, create a Tarmogoyf token. Creating Tarmogoyf tokens is pretty hilarious, and by the time she comes down, those tokens are likely to be relatively large, and because she doesn't care what does the damage, you can get a token the turn you play her. Her other ability will barely come up in Limited, but I guess if you're milling yourself and you have a Necrogoyf in your deck, it could be pretty funny. I do think you'll be able to play her and threaten to get a Tarmogoyf token right away, often enough for her to be a bomb, giving her an A-. Next up, it's Zoetic Moog Ancient, which for 2 generic, a green and a blue is a 2/4 legendary creature elemental. When it enters the battlefield, you create a 1/1 green forest dryad land creature token for each time you've cast your commander from the command zone this game, and at the beginning of each combat, land creatures you control get +X/+X until end of turn, where X is Zoetic's power. This one's an awkward inclusion since the enter the battlefield ability does nothing in Limited, and you're also not going to have land creatures, so it's just an F. Next up, it's Omo, Queen of Vesuva, who for 2 generic and a green-blue hybrid mana is a 1/5 shapeshifter noble. When she enters the battlefield or attacks, put an everything counter on each of up to 1 target land and up to 1 target creature. Each land with an everything counter on it is every land type in addition to its other types. Each non-land creature with an everything counter on it is every creature type. This ETB is unlikely to be relevant very often in this set. As I said earlier, there's not a heavy creature type theme in this set for the most part. Mostly, she'll fix your mana, and she has kind of okay stats, but that's pretty much it, giving her a C. Next up, it's Satya, Aetherflux Genius, which for 1 generic, a blue, a red, and a white is a 3/5 human artificer with menace and haste. When it attacks, you create a tapped and attacking token that's a copy of up to 1 other target non-token creature you control. You get 2 energy. At the beginning of the next end step, sacrifice that token unless you pay an amount of energy equal to its mana value. So even without the energy thing, a 4-mana 3/5 with menace and haste and this attack trigger is a great card. He's going to represent tons of damage out of nowhere, lets you abuse into the battlefield abilities, and so on, and he's likely to survive his first attack thanks to those keywords. So the fact he also generates energy and gives you the ability to hold on to the tokens if you really want to is amazing, giving him an A-. And our last card is Ulalek Fused Atrocity, which costs a colorless white hybrid mana, a colorless blue hybrid mana, a colorless black hybrid mana, a colorless red hybrid mana, and a colorless green hybrid mana for a 2/5 Eldrazi with Devoid. When you cast an Eldrazi spell, you can pay 2 colorless. If you do, copy all spells you control, then copy all other activated and triggered abilities you control. You may choose new targets for the copies. This has some pretty awesome potential, but it's also very, very hard to cast and limited. Some mixture of a bunch of colorless mana or mana of certain colors is possible, but also far from automatic. Furthermore, having a couple colorless left over when you cast an Eldrazi in a turn isn't always going to be easy. So yeah, copying your Eldrazi and all the other stuff on the stack, including an Eldrazi's cast trigger, is awesome, but actually getting Ulalek on the battlefield and actually being able to trigger that ability is really hard to do in limited. I'm going to give him a D. So now we've looked at every single card in Modern Horizons 3's main set and on the bonus sheets. Next, I'll be doing an archetype guide for the entire format. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and share it so that others can enjoy it too. If you want to make sure you catch future videos, don't forget to subscribe. And if you want to catch up on the rest of the set review, you should see a playlist on your screen shortly. Thanks for watching.